ロシアや中国は全部人治国家です。独裁者が治める、金一族を治める、習近平国家主席が治める、ウラジミール・プーチン大統領が治める。日本は違います。法律が治めているんですよ、ね。ロシア、中国も僕は随分回ってきましたけど、ウクライナの核でロシア人が10万人殺されても、プーチンさん平気だと思う。実際やってきたんですよ、それを。例えば、プーチンさんの元をたどればスターリンですけど、スターリンの前がツァーリって皇帝ですけど、自国民どれだけ殺しましたか。だからウクライナが数発核を持ってて、ロシア人が100万人殺されても、プーチン大統領は自分のために、ソ連帝国復活するために、間違いなくウクライナの侵略はやりました。ウクライナで分かったことは、独裁主義がどんなに怖いか、プーチン大統領がソ連帝国復活の立役者になりたいっていうだけで、全ロシアがもうダメになった。スポーツ選手も試合できない。音楽家も演奏活動できない。ところがその怖い独裁主義が日本の隣国です。ね、中露、北朝鮮。ね、そして韓国も大統領選挙やってるけど、そんなこと言ったらロシアだって大統領選挙やってるんですよ。本当に民主主義が成熟した国か、とてもそう思えないです。
この戦争においてロシアの立場に立たない、民主主義国家の立場に立つというのが日本の国益であるという決断のもとで政治的な決定をやっていく。この決定というのは正しいですよ。この戦争であの悪の枢軸のロシア、プーチンに勝たせるということは、もうこれからの世界がもうめちゃくちゃになるということですよ。これでもしもプーチンがこの戦争に勝ってしまって、皆さんがおっしゃる通り、ロシアと中国がさらに密接な関係があったら、これほど最悪な世界は描けません。ですから今のうちに徹底的にこの戦いにおいてウクライナを支援をして、そしてプーチンのロシアを敗北させる、このことが極めて大切だ。そのことが日本の国益になる。
But on May 26, 2022, in an interview with The Economist, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's stance on his country's membership in NATO, and his refusal to resolve the conflict in Donbass, led to the outbreak of war in Ukraine. Maybe the war could have been avoided if Zelensky had been forced to pledge that his country would not join NATO, or had been forced to grant a high degree of autonomy to Luhansk and Donetsk in the east. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe noted, according to The Economist. Moreover, the former Japanese PM added that U.S. President Joe Biden could influence Zelensky to change his position.
Are we in a new Cold War with China?
At the time that we opened to China, Russia was the principal enemy. But our relations with China were about as bad as they could be, because we had fought the Korean War against them. Our view in opening to China was that it was unwise when you have two enemies that you treat them exactly alike, and that you should at least provide an opportunity for whatever differences might appear between them, or for whatever the international situation might produce of different attitudes, to provide a possibility for that. And so this is why, in a tortuous way, we approached China. What produced the opening was the tension that had developed autonomously between Russia and China, and which had an expression in border issues, which we were so convinced that the Chinese were the more ideologically committed, that we at first thought the incidents had been started by the Chinese, but that was not true, that the Russians wanted to teach China a lesson. But Russia could not Brezhnev could not conceive that China and the United States could get together. And Mao, despite all his ideological hostility to us, Mao was ready to begin conversations. It's not in principle, it is an alliance which is against Western interests as now established. But it does not look to me as if this is an intrinsically permanent relationship. It is geographically, demographically, 80% of the Russian population lives in the European part. Much of the Asian part of Russia, most of Siberia was acquired recently, as history is measured, in the second half of the 19th century.
I take it from your answer just now that it would be in America's geopolitical interests to at least encourage more distance between Russia and China. And you touched on the great Siberian, the great empty space north of very densely populated China. I think you could also have mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative coming right through Russia's near abroad. There are neuralgias there, with Russia being a little brother, that are available to exploit, or is that wrong?
I think the geopolitical situation globally will undergo significant changes after the Ukraine war is over. And it is not natural for China and Russia to have identical interests on all foreseeable problems. I don't think we can generate possible disagreements, but I think circumstances, after the Ukraine war, Russia will have to reassess its relationship to Europe at a minimum, and its general attitude towards NATO, and so will America, and especially Europe, have to do when the lessons of this period sink in. And so I think it is unwise to take an adversarial position to two adversaries in a way that drives them together. And once we take aboard this principle in our relationships with Europe and in our internal discussions, I think history will provide opportunities in which we can apply the differential approach. That doesn't mean that either of them will become intimate friends of the West. It only means that on specific issues, as they arise, we leave open the option that a different approach, we are prepared to explore differences in approach in terms of our own relationship without discussing in the abstract what their relationship with each other would be. because that will be determined by their own interests and by their own domestic situation. But in view of general strategy in the period ahead of us, we should not lump Russia and China together as an integral element.
So, I mean, I take it, teasing out from your remarks, that the Biden administration's framing of its grand geopolitical challenge as being democracy versus autocracy, I'm picking up an implicit hint that you think that's the wrong framing?
I am not in agreement with stating an adversarial position as the basic element of the relationship, but of course we have to be conscious of the differences of ideology and of interpretation that exist, but we should use this consciousness to apply it in our own analysis of the importance of issues as they arise, rather than making it the principal issue of confrontation, unless we are prepared to make regime changes the principal goals of our foreign policy, which I think, given the evolution of technology and the enormous destructiveness of weapons that now exist, may be imposed on us by the hostility of others. But we should avoid generating it with our own attitudes.
Okay, let's get into the specifics of today. You made your name, of course, in the 50s, studying nuclear theory and strategy, and then as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State in the 1970s. You have probably more experience than any person alive of how to manage a standoff between two nuclear-armed superpowers. You had a couple of DEFCON 3 or 2 moments. I can't remember which DEFCON level they were, but one was when the Soviets wanted to send peacekeeping troops into the Sinai Desert. Let's not get into that. But today's nuclear language, which is coming thick and fast from Putin, from people around Putin, where do you put that in the context of all the dangers we went through, Cuba Missile Crisis, near accidents in 1983, etc.? Where do you put today's nuclear language in terms of the threat we might be facing today?
Now in a technology where the rapidity of its change, the subtlety of the inventions can produce levels of catastrophe that were not even imaginable in the period that I was talking about. And the strange aspect of the present situation is that the weapons are multiplying on both sides, and their sophistication is increasing literally with every year, and their range and automaticity and almost any other noun you want to attach to them. But there's almost no discussion that's internationally about what would happen if the weapons actually became used. So my appeal in general, in my discussions, on whatever side you are in these discussions, is to understand that we are now living in a totally new era, that we have gotten away as cultures up to now with neglecting that aspect. But as this technology is spread around the world, as it does inherently, diplomacy and war will need a different content, and that will be a challenge for the immediate future.
Now you've met, correct me if I'm wrong, but ballpark, you've met Vladimir Putin 20, 25 times?
Yeah.
The Russian military nuclear doctrine is that they will respond with nuclear weapons or consider the use of nuclear weapons if they feel that the regime is under existential threat, that its existence. But of course, the word existential is in the eye of the beholder. Where do you think Putin's red line is in this situation?
I have met Putin as a student of international affairs about once a year for a period of maybe 15 years for purely academic and strategic discussions to try to learn his thinking and impart whatever thinking I had if he, as the conversation developed. I thought his basic convictions were a kind of mystic faith in Russian history as he conceived it, and that he felt offended in that sense, not by anything we did particularly at first, but simply by this huge gap that opened up between Europe and the East, when the security lines were moved from the Elbe towards some, at first, undefined future. And so he, as I understood him, was offended and threatened, and felt Russia was threatened by the absorption of this whole area into NATO. This does not excuse, and I would not have predicted, an attack of the magnitude of taking over a recognized country with which all kinds of non-military agreements existed. And he miscalculated the situation he faced internationally, and he obviously miscalculated Russia's capabilities to sustain such a major enterprise. And when the time for settlement comes, all parties will need to take that into consideration, that we are not going back to the previous relationship, but to a position for Russia that will be different as a result of this, and not because we demanded it, because they have produced it.
You say that Putin miscalculated, I mean, arguably massively miscalculated in his expectations of the military conquest of Ukraine and the reception he would get from Ukrainians. Now, a lot of the nuclear theory and strategic theory you worked on assumes people have good information and that they can act rationally on their good information. Do you think he's now recalibrating, having miscalculated? Do you think he's getting good information? And if he isn't, what further miscalculations should we be preparing for?
In all these crises, one has to try to understand what the inner red line is for the opposite number. And if we had met 6 months ago, well, I first, as I said, wouldn't have thought that he would start a war of that scale in Europe or anywhere. So the obvious question is, first of all, how long will this escalation continue? And how much scope does he have for further escalation? Or has he reached the limit of his capabilities? And he has to decide at what point escalating the war will strain his society to a point that will limit its fitness to conduct international policy as a great power in the future. I have no judgment when he will come to that point. The second level is when that point is reached. Will he escalate by moving into categories of weapons that in 70 years of their existence have never been used? Weapons in which nuclear countries accepted defeat from non-nuclear countries, like both Russia and we in Afghanistan, without resorting to weapons which, in a purely technical sense, could have ended the conflict. So if that line is crossed, that will be an extraordinarily significant event, because we have not thought through globally what the next dividing lines would be. And we have to think of how to react were it to happen. But one thing we could not do, in my opinion, is just accept it, because that would open a new method of blackmail.
I mean, you've met Xi Jinping many times too, and his predecessors. You know China well. What lessons is China drawing from this?
Any Chinese leader now, or all Chinese leaders, would be reflecting how to avoid getting into the situation into which Putin got himself, and how to be in a position where in any crisis that might arise, they would not have a major part of the world turned against them. And the key decision America and China will have to make down the road, and not in any 1 month, is your first question. Is the relationship so adversarial that there is no hope of composing even parts of it? And therefore, must every issue be dealt with in terms of relative position? therefore, it's the best hope of restraint, the self-restraint of leaders on both sides.
Thank you very much for joining us and for making the effort to come down here today. And I'm sure everyone else will join me in appreciation of your
I think I can say this. Prime Minister Abe of Japan gave me the most beautiful copy of a letter that he sent to the people who give out a thing called the Nobel Prize. He said, I have nominated you, or respectfully on behalf of Japan, I am asking them to give you the Nobel Peace Prize. I said, thank you. Many other people feel that way too. I'll probably never get it, but that's okay.
And these are busy times for Donald Trump, meeting with Japan's prime minister. It took place at Trump Tower, and it was Trump's first meeting with a foreign leader since being elected.
Will be signed between the Japanese companies and companies based out of Gujarat. Namaskar. About 10年前、私はインド国会で演説する栄誉に浴しました。日印関係は世界で最も可能性を秘めた二国間関係である。強いインドは日本のため、強い日本はインドのため、この私の信念を強調し、インド洋と太平洋という2つの海の交わりを担う日印両国の絆が必然的に導く光あふれる未来について述べました。平和条約交渉の再開についてであります。今回、プーチン大統領と私は、戦後60何年を経て、日露間で平和条約が締結をされていない状態は異常であるとの認識を確認いたしました。
Эта проблема досталась, не мы ее создали, она досталась нам из прошлого. И мы искренне хотим ее решить на приемлемых условиях для обеих сторон.
Your attention, please. May I have your attention, please?
Arigato.